Welcome, everybody. We've got today with us, very honored to have Roger Silverman, who's on the steering committee of the Labour Left Alliance, who is going to talk about the witch hunt against Militant in the 1980s. And he was there. Okay, Roger, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, comrades. Right, this series is focused on the history of witch hunts in the Labour Party, and there's no mystery as to why this is of immediate relevance. But I think it's becoming clear to everyone now that this word is not really adequate to explain quite what is happening now. This is not just a mere witch hunt, which I would define as a campaign of persecution against a targeted and defamed minority. It's nothing less than the systematic destruction of the Labour Party itself as an autonomous political party. The witch hunts of the past were aimed at distinct individuals or factions. First at the nascent Communist Party, later at fellow travellers or direct agents of Stalinism, and often at individual mavericks, rebel MPs, or militant critics of the leadership, like at various times Lansbury, Cripps, Bevan, Michael Foot, my own father, who had the whip withdrawn first by Attlee and then again by Gaitskell, and who died when he was on the verge of similar reprisals by Wilson. But the most systematic purge since those days in the 1980s was, of course, the witch hunt of Militant. Now, I, of course, should declare my interest from the start. I will make no apology for speaking from a tendentious viewpoint. As a founder member of Militant, a member of the Militant group for 30 years and for 20 years as a full-timer. I did decisively break from it in the early 1990s, and I am opposed to all three of its surviving fragments today. But nevertheless, I acknowledge unreservedly the priceless education I drew from my experience with it. I would have liked to give an overall political history of Militant because it's rich in lessons, both positive and negative. And perhaps on another occasion, I can get that opportunity. But to some extent, even here, it's impossible to separate the history of the organizational attacks on Militant from the political context. Now, Militant had its origins in one splinter from the Revolutionary Communist Party of the 1940s, which had been an amalgamation of small Trotskyist groups. Trotsky's handful of followers had concluded that a new mass international movement would inevitably arise out of the ashes of the coming World War. Just as the First World War had shattered the authority of the Socialist International, which had betrayed its earlier ringing promises and abandoned internationalism for obedience to the respective rival imperialist powers, so too the coming World War would destroy the foundations of both the Socialist and Communist internationals and create a new international. And in preparation for this, they had convened in 1938 a founding conference of a Fourth International, which was a kind of anticipation of a future mass world party. Now, at the end of the Second World War, the precursors and founders of Militant had alone had the insight and audacity to challenge the accepted orthodoxies of contemporary Trotskyism and to modify the perspectives that Trotsky himself had advanced in his last months. The prognosis that the revolutionary wave that was bound to follow the coming World War would destroy the traditional parties of the working class, and that just as the Second International had collapsed in the First World War, the reformist and Stalinist parties would crumble, and that within 10 years, not one stone would remain upon another, as he put it, of either the Socialist or the Communist internationals, and that the Fourth International would become the decisive force on the planet. Now, in 1940, there had been a justification for these prognoses. But of course, as always happens, reality has a habit of overtaking even the most brilliant prognoses. For a whole historical period, on the basis of the economic upswing and of the spread of Stalinism to a number of new countries, both the reformist and the Stalinist parties became, on the contrary, not undermined, but strengthened. Those former Trotskyist groups, which were incapable of drawing up bold, fresh perspectives, completely degenerated. there were still even some self-styled Trotskyists who, believe it or not, as late as in 1947, were still crowing that there's still a year to go. Trotsky said, within 10 years, not one stone will be left upon the other, etc., etc. And Ted Grant, who was the theoretical founder, if you like, of the militant tendency, had the insight to understand that developments during the war had undermined that prognosis, and that once the revolutionary wave did indeed sweep the world, in 1945 to 7 and subsided, that then for a whole period, both reformism and socialism would be temporarily strengthened, and that there was a need to adapt tactically accordingly. And the RCP had split on questions of tactics and perspectives. And after a succession of twists and turns and dives and ducks and contortions, Militant actually began publication as a newspaper in 1964. Now, I have a memory of that because that was precisely when I joined it. And it began publication simultaneously with a wave of radicalization that was sweeping society, a rejection of the antiquated hierarchical establishment, and a kind of youth rebellion. And this coincided with the election of the Wilson government in 1964. And Militant began to sink roots in the party, and following what had been kind of harakiri adventures by both the Heeleyite Socialist Labour League and the Cliffite International Socialism tendency, the Militant built what became a thriving mass youth organization in the Labour Party Young Socialists. Now, what Militant achieved at that time, whatever you think of its later mistakes and of its weaknesses in other respects, what it achieved was, in its day, was spectacular. And I maintain that it was Militant's overall theoretical perspective in the preparatory years which won it a well-deserved reputation for foresight and clarity of analysis, in contrast to the eclectic twists and turns of its rivals. Built up painfully over decades, it was its political authority that was originally its sole asset. In those early days, a thorough political grounding and intensive theoretical education was its fundamental strength, although that rather weakened in a later period. But on the basis of its unshakable conviction, it did achieve miracles of organization. And these included, long before the spectacular exploits in Liverpool or the poll tax campaign, it included feats of fundraising and administrative skill in building an apparatus, a structure, a network of full-timers, a headquarters, international interventions, influence in the workers' organizations, mass youth agitation, trade union penetration, etc., that were to stun its enemies. And second only to this political confidence was its firm and disciplined orientation to the labor movement and its patient strategy and its finely tuned tactics. And it was through clear ideas and hard work that its cadres earned influence. And it enjoyed not only reserves of political capital accumulated over 3 decades, but also the confidence, youth, elan, experience, virtuoso presentational and organizational skills, and of course, strong roots in the labor movement. And this, in the period of the 60s and 70s, this had enabled it to train a generation of capable cadres with an intimate knowledge of the history of international workers' struggles, with well-honed skills in speaking and debating, and certainly initially in respect for the traditions of the labour movement. The 1980s marked the point where in Britain, it began to be able to cross the barrier between passivity and active intervention, winning sometimes quite spectacular victories. In the early 1980s, Militant won control of the Labour Party Young Socialists. In fact, in the 70s, Militant won control of the Labour Party Young Socialists and began to turn it into a mass youth movement, campaigning on its programme and slogans. And later it won the presidency of the CPSA, Civil Service Union, and several places on its national executive. And in Liverpool, it gained a particularly strong position. In 1983, Militant, under the influence of Militant, Labour won control of Liverpool Council. And it gained until quite recently, Labour had not even been able to control the council. It was dominated by the Liberals in the period before that. But it won control of Liverpool Council in 1983 with a 40% rise in the vote. 22,000 extra voters had come out and turned out for Labour in that campaign. And it was on a programme of no privatisation, of cuts in the rent, of no cuts in spending, a massive housing repair programme, the building of 6,000 new council houses, 4,000 new council jobs to be created, no rises in the rate, and so on. And at the 1983 general election, where nationally Labour bombed and got an abysmally poor result, in Liverpool there was actually a swing towards Labour. Terry Fields was elected in Liverpool Broad Green, and further south in Coventry South East, Dave Nellis won the seat, won that seat. And later in 1987, Pat Wall in the Bradford area also won a seat in Parliament. And by the mid-80s, militant councillors in Liverpool were leading the population in a 5-year struggle against the Thatcher government. They formed the leadership of the Liverpool Labour movement and of the City Council, establishing a record of unprecedented and model achievements for a municipal council, and organising in one case at least, a general strike in their support of 30,000 workers. The government threatened to send in the troops, and eventually they had to use the law courts to throw out of office most of Labour's popular and democratically elected councillors. And when they were dismissed from office, a new team, a second 11 of substitute candidates, was elected in their place. And when those councillors were personally surcharged to meet the council's deficit, in street collections, the people of Liverpool amply covered their fines. This struggle, which was already perhaps the biggest movement led by Trotskyists for decades, was immediately followed by an even bigger achievement, the struggle against the hated poll tax. And irrespective of false claims of groups like the SWP, which initially scornfully dismissed out of hand the idea of a non-payment campaign, Militant was initially the sole left tendency to understand in advance that the tax could be defeated by direct mass action. And its comrades had the courage to play the decisive role in launching a mass civil disobedience campaign, in the course of which dozens of its activists were jailed, and 18 million people were emboldened to refuse payment. 250,000 people were mobilized in, I think, 1990 for one of the biggest demonstrations in British history. And within 2 or 3 years, as we know, the campaign achieved total victory with the scrapping of the tax and the overthrow of Mrs. Thatcher personally, the world's most enduring symbol of reaction. And it was during this period that Militant achieved its most spectacular successes. As I said, 3 members were elected as Labour MPs, all known Marxists and proud Militant supporters. Pat Wall was emblazoned on the tabloid front pages when he made a speech at just a local meeting where he gave honest warnings of the threat of civil war if Labour were not to adopt a militant policy. And he was, briefly, he was, presented as an absolute scarecrow and a warning. Terry Fields MP was jailed for his defiant refusal to pay the poll tax. Derek Hatton in Liverpool was accused of corruption, and he was exonerated, cleared of all charges, following a bogus investigation involving no fewer than 280 police officers. Tommy Sheridan in Glasgow, he won an election to Glasgow City Council from a prison cell. These were the kind of exploits, if you like, that made Militant become almost a household name. And as I said, militant supporters won control of the biggest civil service union. And in the course of its intervention in the miners' strike, hundreds of miners also were won to its ranks. And there was a period when militants had entered into the psyche of society. And to this day, you see repeated invocations in the media which remind us that the memory of that period still haunts the establishment. As I say, it had formed an important contingent among the shock troops in the miners' strike, led Britain's fifth city in a prolonged struggle against the Tory government, mobilized 18 million people in one of the biggest civil disobedience campaigns in history, and in effect, overthrown a prime minister. And for good measure, it had built an autonomous youth organization under the auspices of the Labour Party, built a strong base in several trade unions, and on one occasion mobilized 40,000 youth on a Europe-wide demonstration against racism. And there's much else besides. But before I come to the actual the details of the witch hunt, I'd also just mention one other thing. It organized mass jamborees, if you like. In its 1982 Wembley conference, it gathered 3,000 people, and that included 1,622 delegates from constituency Labour parties and 412 trade union branch delegates. And this was noticed by the media. The Mail on Sunday reported that the size of the crowd of the packed Wembley Conference Centre surprised militant critics. And the News of the World commented, by any yardstick, yesterday's rally by supporters of the militant tendency was menacingly impressive. And they commented that it's almost as big as the Labour Party itself could muster. And then again in 1983, there was another huge conference at which £40,000 was collected in pledges. And the LPYS also organised school strikes against youth unemployment. And as I said, the All-European Youth Demonstration. 14 million viewers watched a live debate between Peter Taff and Tony Mulhern on the one side for Militants and a right-wing Labour MP. And, you know, it's no exaggeration to say that the militant tendency entered into the calculations, strategies, tactics, and, if you like, the nightmares, not only of the Labour bureaucracy, but of the ruling class itself. It was singled out for denunciation by Kinnock at the Labour Party conference and by Thatcher in Parliament. And the very name militant became a household word, figuring in popular parlance, in crosswords, in game shows, etc. So all of this did strike alarm in the ruling class. Militant had previously been tolerated as a harmless irritant by the Labour Party bureaucrats in the days when militant supporters were humbly peddling a monthly paper in little Labour Party ward meetings up and down the country. But by this point, the ruling class itself was alarmed. And after it began very suddenly with a scare campaign in the press. One morning, I was accosted outside my front door by a reporter from the Daily Express, and a mugshot appeared of me the next morning. So that was how the scare campaign began. And soon, as I say, later, Mrs. Thatcher was to shrilly denounce militant Parliament. Kinnock called militant supporters maggots. He made his despicable attack on militant the centrepiece of his election campaign in 1983. The High Court intervenes to disqualify elected militant councillors and to overturn the election of militant trade union leaders. And in the Labour Party, the witch hunt gathered full swing, with a wave of expulsions amounting to a mass purge. The Labour Party bureaucracy became so terrified that it was prepared to risk wrecking the party itself as a living forum of working class political life. Hundreds were expelled in the first mass purge of the Labour Party in decades. Now, tentative attempts had already previously been made and then hastily retracted to politically police the party. And when finally the Labour Party improvised a short-term tactic, which it soon dropped, of opening a so-called register of admissible groups, Militant applied to join it. And when it did, its application was denied and the approval of the register scraped through but the NEC by only 12 votes to 11. And it's interesting, by the way, at that time, Neil Kinnock voted against. The 200 constituency parties passed resolutions condemning the incipient witch hunt. Regional conferences passed resolutions opposing it in Scotland, West Midlands, the Northwest, London, the Southern region, the Southwest. Dennis Healy had to excuse the party by saying, "This is not a witch hunt, it's a militant hunt." A vicious, dirty campaign of hysteria was launched and a classic witch hunt. And all that's outrageous, sure. But compare the measures adopted then to what's happening now. In December 1982 and February 1983, 5 militant editorial board members were indicted, and they had the right to participate in 2 consecutive meetings of the National Executive Committee, where they came there in person to face and to answer charges in relation to their forthcoming expulsion. And not only that, but at the 1983 Labour Party conference, each one of the 5 editorial board members was given the right to appeal directly to the conference, each of them given 5 minutes to appeal. So that meant that the Labour Party conference had to listen to 25 minutes of uninterrupted Trotskyist speeches. And it's interesting that at that conference, when it came to the vote on the expulsion, 80% of the CLP delegates and a number of rank and file trade union delegates voted against the expulsion. But this was only the beginning of the purge. In 1985-6, it became a real escalation, a full-blown witch hunt. The television program World in Action screened a vicious personal attack on Derek Hatton, which even the Sunday Times complained that this was not an interview, this was an interrogation. The right-wing Labour official Tom Sawyer defended the witch hunt on very interesting grounds. He said, "I defy anyone to tell me how you can go to Liverpool and defeat Militant by argument." There were protest meetings against the witch hunt of 1,000 plus in London, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Newcastle, and Sheffield, with a total attendance of 50,000. The Financial Times made a comment that it was tireless dedication and hard work for the party and potential voters, which was the principal means through which Militant deservedly accrued a moral basis for its power in Liverpool. As a result of a High Court judgment, the National Executive had to drop its original charges of malpractices and intimidation and relied instead on new accusations. And what was the accusation? That Derek Hatton and Tony Mulhern had spoken at militant meetings. They rather were embarrassed when it was put to them that so had Neil Kinnock at one meeting in 1980, and he'd even donated £5 to the Militant Fighting Fund. So anyway, when it came to the expulsions of the Liverpool comrades, each of them, again, was summoned to the Labour Party headquarters and had the right to defend themselves at a hearing by the National Executive. Interesting story, when one of them when one of them arrived, the General Secretary, Larry Whitty, began introducing the members of the NEC panel to him, and he replied, "Yes, I know, I do watch Spitting Image." Now, initially 8 Merseyside militant members were expelled, but they too had the right of appeal to the 1986 Labour Party conference. And I don't know whether they were right or wrong, but they demanded that this session be broadcast live, that it shouldn't be a closed session of conference. And when this appeal was denied, they walked out. But again, when it came to the vote, 236 constituency delegates, plus the bakers and the furniture workers unions, voted against their expulsion. At the 1983 local elections in Liverpool, when there had been a landslide vote for Labour, the Liverpool Echo reported, "There's not a shadow of doubt that Liverpool's town hall election results were a success for Militant. No Scouser could have been under any illusion that a vote for Labour in this city was a vote for Militant. And Militant supporters had also won seats in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Brighton, Tyneside, the Wirral, Coventry and London. In Liverpool, the district auditor had imposed a surcharge of £106,000 on the councillors and banned them from office for 5 years. I already mentioned that. But when bucket collections were held in the city centre, over £600,000 was collected from the people of Liverpool in support of these councillors. And of course, there'd been later the poll tax campaign, the biggest demonstration since the Chartists, etc. So this was the high point. Spectacular achievements by far surpassing any previous mobilizations for decades. And Trotskyism had become, if you like, acknowledged as a legitimate strand embodied in the labor movement rather than something on the exotic fringe. But paradoxically, I have to say, and this is going back to the political evolution, because I do want to put this in context, especially as I've been painting only one side of things. By a curious twist of timing, its greatest practical glories did come in the 1980s, but that was a period when its theoretical sharpness was becoming very much blunted. In contrast to just about every other Marxist tendency, throughout its history from the 1960s to the end of the 1980s, Militant had been uniquely free from internal dissension and splits. And that's because, in my opinion, it had started with a viable analysis and perspective that had stood the test of experience. But in the course of the 1980s, its perspectives had become increasingly at variance with objective reality, and its vision was already failing. I wish there were time to go deeper into the reasons for this, but of course this is not the place. But its theoretical foundation had become undermined, and but this was not to be really exposed until the historic shocks of the early 1990s, which precipitated its first major and shattering split. The tendency momentum had been sufficient to carry it well into a period when beneath the surface, its perspectives were becoming increasingly at odds with reality. For 3 decades following the end of the World War, its theoretical analysis and perspectives were well-founded and proven, and that was the basis of its authority. But there was increasingly an imbalance between its political victories throughout the 1980s and its manifest theoretical failure to anticipate events at the end of the decade. And of course, it was by no means alone in this. The world was changing. The collapse of the Tsarist states, the unexpectedly prolonged development of new technology, the crushing of the miners, the defeat of the heavy battalions of labor, the liquidation of the industrial proletariat to a large extent, successive electoral defeats, the wholesale privatization of the economy, and the consequent triumph of Blairism created a completely different balance of forces. New Labour was devised as an explicitly different party, overtly consigning socialist aspirations to the scrap heap. And all of these factors became a source of disorientation for the left, and specifically, in this case, for Militant. It had proved incapable of repeating the bold reappraisal of the world balance of forces that its founders had had in the 1940s. Historical reality was bypassing the by now ossified perspectives of Militant. And how did it react? Like many left groups before it, it resorted to desperate measures of improvisation, adventurism, and grandiose delusions. In retrospect, it's open to question even whether it was right to stand an independent candidate against Labour at the Walton by-election, but although there were extenuating factors. But we have to say, subsequent to that, certainly, it made a premature and hastily contrived break from Labour. It deluded itself that it could conjure up what it called a small mass party, whatever that is, and embarked on an ultra-left binge, adopting 2 consecutive name changes, first to Militant Labour, and then impulsively hurtling into a classic trap. And this is what I want to end with. It's an ironic sequence that we've seen in the history of so many left groups. It's almost become a rule. It's only once their membership dips below a certain critical point that they decide in desperation to proclaim themselves a party. That happened with the Socialist Labour League, which renamed itself the Workers' Revolutionary Party. It happened with the International Socialists, which renamed themselves the Socialist Workers' Party. And exactly the same fatal progression was followed by Militant, the relics of which now designate themselves as the Socialist Party. They turned their backs on the Labour Party prematurely. They found themselves in the political wilderness just at that moment when the birth of a mass left wing and the impending process of a class split in the Labour Party was about to come to fruition. It tied itself in ever greater knots, 6 successive gyrations over the Corbyn phenomenon. They started by denouncing the Labour Party as an all-out bourgeois party. Then they ruled out any possibility of Corbyn winning the election. Then they claimed, when he had won it, that it was through their experience, their influence on the trade union delegations, that was how he achieved it. Then, from being a bourgeois party, they were demanding affiliation of Militant to the party as a constituent part. And then, when all that failed, and when the whole episode had passed, once again, they were triumphantly abandoning the party with a self-satisfied smirk of gratification. And I have to say, today it is absolutely pathetic and contemptible to see supporters of the so-called Socialist Party now hurling the same kind of spiteful taunts and jeers at us. For instance, on Facebook, I've had comments on my Facebook postings. You're propping up Starmer. What are you doing in the Labour Party? You know, the same jeers that the ultra-left sectarians always used to use against militants in the old days. So, returning to the history of Labour witch hunts, just look, as I said before, but just look at the contrast between those days and now. A few days ago, along with many of you who are here today, I'm sure, and many others, I received notice by email that my membership was, quote, terminated. That's the word now used, not suspension, exclusion, expulsion, etc. No inquiry, no hearing, no appeal, no due process. I think we should now call David Evans the Terminator. I didn't even receive, by the way, the standard kind link to the Samaritans, which previous recipients of the letter have had, and that may be something to do with the fact that my previous 2 mails from the Labour Party had been requests to remember the party in my will. But not even a token genuflection towards due process or natural justice from the Labour Party, just a terse email in the style of Lord Sugar or Donald Trump, you're fired. Or Lewis Carroll's Red Queen, off with his head. Of course, in Alice in Wonderland, remember there's a trial where the order was reversed. First the sentence, then the verdict, and only then the trial. But in Evans's Labour Party, it never reaches the stage even of a trial. Perhaps a better analogy is Kafka. All this, how we got to this mess, is of course the subject of the next in the series and subsequent meetings after Christmas. Thanks, comrades.
Right. Thank you very much, Roger. That was as fascinating as we expected. Steve Freeman was asking, and I'm sure he's not the only one. He was asking. He wished you would have spoken a bit more about what happened to Militant with the theory when you say it went all wrong. It would be quite interesting, I think, if you want to get back to that later today. It's quite funny you being accused of propping up Starmer. I don't think Starmer quite sees it that way. So I think there's obviously different ways how you can get involved in the Labour Party, and if you do it critically, there's certainly a use for it. But it's a bit sad that organizations, I think like the SWP and Tusk and Socialist Party, they're probably quite happy now that Corbyn has been defeated because everything is back to normal. They can build their little group outside and tell everybody that the Labour Party is finished and dead, and we don't have to get involved with it. That might be unfair, but I don't think it is quite unfair. Anyway, we've got a few people who've got their hand up already. Tony first, please.
Right, yeah, thank you, Roger. I was in Brighton, well, I still am in Brighton, in the 1980s, when, of course, Militant was at the height of its power. In fact, Brighton Kemp Town had the first militant candidate in the country, Rod Fitch, who was elected. But I do have a different political analysis and an understanding of Militant. Roger would see them presumably at that time as a revolutionary socialist group. I always saw them as, if you like, reaching the maximum limit of reformism with their demand on the state for the nationalisation. I think it was at the top 25 companies and so on. But we had differences. I mean, for a start in Brighton, I mean, the left was divided between Militants and also Labour briefing, and it was very, very difficult working with Militants. Ray Apps, I remember well, and I mean, Bill North is still a friend of mine, and so on. But Militants really did keep to themselves in terms of building, and it was very difficult to get cross unity. In fact, unity between us only came with the suspension of Brighton Labour Party in 1992, 1992 rather, 1993, when we formed the Friends of Brighton Labour Party. And of course, as Roger says, things were very different then. There were 30 of us who were either suspended or expelled, and some of them today are in Brighton LLA. In fact, some of us have been suspended and expelled twice as a result. But at that time, they hired a whole hotel, the Royal Albion, for the hearings, and they went on for 2 weekends. And they brought Larry Whitty down. I can remember for my own suspension, he personally, as the General Secretary, personally conducted the prosecution, if you like. So it was very, very different to what happens today, when you don't get a hearing at all, when there is no due process whatsoever. I would agree with Roger that there were impressive achievements in Liverpool. I don't think it can be doubted, but they also reached their maximum, and I don't think they knew where to go from there, having achieved power in the council, having built the council houses and so on. And I also think they did make many political mistakes. In 1985 or 4-5, they won a victory against the Thatcher government when the Thatcher government increased their rate support grant. But one of the major reasons for that was, of course, the fact that there was a miners' strike on, and the Tories didn't want to take on two enemies at one time. The following year, when the miners had been defeated, then they targeted Liverpool, and Liverpool was defeated in that struggle. So I think we have to take into account the circumstances of what happened, but also the limits of Militant's own programme. When I said it, in my opinion, it was the maximum of reformism. They never ever challenged the state. And one of the real debates that we had in Brighton at the time, and I think nationally as well, was over Militant's attitude in Northern Ireland. They refused to support troops out of Ireland, and I think that was a great political mistake. They did not challenge the British state and the way it operated. They called for unity of the working class in Northern Ireland, which is fine. But what they refused to recognise was the things that prevented workers' unity in Ireland, namely the British presence and Protestant supremacy, as symbolised in the Northern Ireland statehood itself. So they gave no support whatsoever to the Republicans. And they had very much the same attitude, ironically, today in the Socialist Party, to Zionism, where they make a priority about the Israeli Jewish working class, without understanding that sections of the working class can have privileges and powers by very virtue of the fact that it's a settler colonial state. And that was the case in Ireland. So they never ever understood what was dividing the Irish working class. And that goes back to partition, which is the living symbol of that division. So I think one has to have a more balanced perspective. I mean, there were other things as well, which I think Militant were very bad on. They opposed black sections, for instance, and therefore found themselves in conflict with black people, both in Liverpool and outside. And I think that was a great political mistake. But I grant you that on the poll tax, I mean, they took exactly the right perspective, and they built or helped build an extremely wide mass movement. It wasn't only Militant that did that, but it was the poll tax which laid the basis for the victory at the Scottish Assembly elections of the 6 Scottish Socialist MPs led by Tommy Sheridan. There's absolutely no doubt. The tragedy of that, of course, is the way the SSP crumbled in the end, and I have no doubt it was state involvement in the SSP which caused that. But I do think one has to have a more balanced perspective on Militant and to learn from its mistakes as well as its successes. Thanks.
Thank you. Harry, please. Next. Roger, anytime you want to come in, give me a little wave or something, yeah?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, comrades. Harry here from Northern Ireland Labour Party. As someone who was 16 years in the Militant, I joined in 1988. I suppose we in north of Ireland, we were not subjected to the enormous purge that was taken inside the Labour Party at that time. We were a very strong organisation, however, here in Ireland. I mean, in the 1970s, Northern Ireland, the Militant, had about 11 full-timers, very powerful at that stage. I want to really, I wish I had longer to answer Tony's questions on the influence that we had here, because by the 1980s, we were, you know, a much smaller organisation, and certainly into the 90s. But despite being a very small group, we had a major influence in changing the political direction here. In 1992, there was a spate of sectarian massacres taking place. The Militant were very influential in a small trades council where I am today and based in Mid-Ulster. And after it was known as a Demise massacre in Mid-Ulster, it was the Militant that had control of this trades council, organised anti-sectarian strikes in this area, and called for the Irish Congress of Trade Unions to back the strike. Now, initially, they condemned us. There was a bunch of loonies, loony left, didn't represent anyone. But we forced the Irish Congress of Trade Unions to back the strike here in Mid-Ulster. It turned out to be a very successful strike and forced the Irish Congress of Trade Unions to follow our example and organise a massive anti-sectarian trade union-based strike in Belfast, one of the biggest in Belfast history. 20,000 people marched to the centre of Belfast. What that did was change the objective situation here, because the following year, Sinn Féin sued for peace, and then it led up to the late 90s, where they organised the Good Friday Agreement. In other words, the bourgeois got credit for bringing the end of the Troubles, when in fact, it was the intervention of the Militant in the 1990s that brought about this objective change that brought about the end of the Troubles. And it just shows what a major influence, what a small political organisation with the correct direction has and can change the whole situation here. What I want to really talk about is towards the latter part of Roger's address, and that is in many ways the demise of the Militant. The Militant being a very powerful international, organised in 30 countries of the world, as Roger explains, highly organised and highly educated. The 1992 really was the beginning of the demise of the Militant. And that was to do the open turn, where they were pulling out of mass organisations, not just the British Labour Party and the movement, but also internationally as well. And after that, it effectively became a sect. The Militant, of course, split, internationally split. But it's what happened afterwards is that really was brought in the sad legacy of the Militant. because there was in fact then the militant purge. The leadership was purging its own members. Here in Ireland, there was roughly about maybe 60 to 80 members were purged out of the Militant. I was one of them. Around 2004, roughly, I was expelled from the Militant. And when you look at what I was trying to do and what they were not trying to do, was to continue organizing in the trade union movement, organizing working class areas, and concentrating very much solely on the youth. And much as I argued that we need to still concentrate in the trade union movement, I was accused of being anti-youth and so on. But effectively, it was that purge that they really brought out a further demise of the Militant. When you look at that purge of the Militant on its own members, I think you begin to realize what was the reason behind pulling out of the mass working class parties. It was a degeneration of the theoretical degeneration of the leadership in the Militant. Moving out of the mass working class parties, they became a sect. They became very, very controlling. And effectively, if you didn't agree with the line, you were not welcome into the organization. And if you look at the Militant today, which is, I think as Rogers has said to us, a very sad reflection of what it once was. But if you ever go into the CWI websites and take a look at them, just how controlling, they have this continual praise for Trotsky, even not recognizing many of Trotsky's mistakes that he made over the year. It is a sad sect that is completely bureaucratic, in my own opinion, very Stalinist orientated at the very top. But it was that purge and that crucial mistake that was made in 1992 in the open turn. I have to hold my hands up, by the way, because I went along with the open turn, but sadly reflect on it today, it was a serious mistake. And if I would like to mention one person in particular, and that is a comrade John Throne, who was based in Chicago, was the very first to recognize that this was leading towards a more bureaucratic militant and effectively would spell the end of the militant of any major international powerful movement. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Yes, I think the renaming of into Socialist Party coincided with the becoming a sect, ironically. Roger, do you want to speak next, or shall I take one?
No, I'll leave it for a bit.
Okay, Marion then, please.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion, this. As I've put in the notes, I mean, I was in Tamworth at the time of the witch hunt in Militant. I've never been a member of Militant. I've been in other left organisations, but never Militant. But the first resolution that I moved at the CLP was in defence against the witch hunt, and I mean, I was shaking like a leaf. I hadn't done much speaking then. I was shaking like a leaf, but it was so important for me to defend against the unjustified witch hunt. Now, I've worked with some people in the militant tendency, both in the Labour Party and in my trade union. And although I agreed with some of it, I also think they were very weak on the self-organisation of the oppressed, women, blacks and other groups at that time. And I engaged in some discussion with them. I think in the early days, they did do a lot of the theoretical education, which I think is so important. And that's why I think these talks and that are very important, because without education and thinking, you don't develop enough to know what's going on and what you need to do to change things. But consistently, most of my time in my own branch in Birmingham and in Coventry and at union conferences, I've consistently argued against their position on the Labour Party, because they've got it totally wrong well, ever since they did what turns they did. And I think they're right. I think that the contention that when they decided that they could set up a party at that stage, that's where it went wrong. They became too big-headed in a way, and they weren't doing a lot of the theoretical stuff. And I'm not very good on theory. I'm still developing in a lot of ways. But one thing I would say, the British left is very poor on theory and on developing things and having proper discussions. That's why these Thursday nights are so important, because there's an openness where people can express views. And I think that's so key, because without democracy, and most of the left groups don't have proper democracy, they have become Stalinized a lot, but we have to keep on doing what we're doing now to try and bring about a situation where we can develop. And for me, that is making sure we oppose all the witch hunts and we continue the fight both inside and outside the Labour Party. But I think there does need to be a deepening of the theoretical understanding of things, and myself included, mustn't be too lazy in developing ourselves and developing that understanding, because we need to make major changes, and there's going to be real openings coming. I'm quite optimistic in that. I know it's really hard at the moment, but there are big openings if you look at it. We just have to be prepared to work hard and try and change the world, really.
Thanks very much, Marion. Good contribution. I think you're absolutely spot on that without democracy, your organization turn into sects. You know, if you have one line that everybody has to adhere to, and you out the door if you disagree, that's not a serious way to build any kind of organization. Matthew Jones, do you want to come in now?
Hi, comrades. Yeah, it's a useful discussion. Thanks to Roger and everybody for starting this. And I think that what Marion is saying is very true, and I think you can do it needs to be developed. I mean, if you look at the theoretical basis of the British left has never been particularly high. And in fact, it's very interesting. Of course, the dominant three dominant comrades in the British Trotskyist tradition are, of course, Tony Cliff, a Palestinian Jew, Jerry Healy, an Irishman, and Ted Grant, a Jewish guy from South Africa. So you can see, obviously, the input from elsewhere that actually has been critical in terms of the development of these tendencies. It does amaze me, actually, that, as comrades have said, the level of the militant, given that Ted Grant did come from, you know, the tradition Cape Town, which was of a far higher standard. You know, I mean, they did actually have an understanding of Trotsky, and they had actually built a mass organisation that had an effect over a very long period of time into the working class in that area. And the fact that, you know, to build something like the Militant, which was, I mean, you know, a very low political level, really, and quite, as comrades have said, quite reformist in its politics, and also very, you know, interesting enough, conducted itself in a very sectarian fashion towards the rest of the left. You know, regarded everybody outside largely as the ultra left, and refused to discuss or deal with them. Even when it came to defending themselves, I mean, they wouldn't even participate in any. They would always make sure that there was in any campaign. It was explicitly run by them, and everybody else was kept out or kept at arm's length, or certainly kept away from any form of decision making point. You know, I mean, I remember being a member. I was a member at one point of Coventry South East, which was you know, Dave Nellis' constituency, before he was elected, and the split between the militants and the rest of the left over, you know, because essentially the militant would make compromises with the right wing, actually, and the rest of the left were not prepared to, and were prepared to take on the right wing and attempt to remove them from their sort of, you know, particularly obviously their ward fastnesses and the fact that they were using it, you know, which of course is how they controlled the council. But of course, you know, the right wing would vote for the militants because they knew the militants would leave them alone. You know, so And I think that, the interesting thing, of course, is then as I say, that as Roger points out, the difference in terms of the witch hunt. But it's then, of course, what is the political understanding and the political level? And I think that the problem is, of course, as I okay, I'm sitting here as somebody who's never a member of the Militant, but I certainly didn't get the impression that there was a great deal of internal political life or discussion or disagreement. I mean, every time you have any serious organisation, you're going to have disagreements. And in fact, this is key to, say, the foundation of IS. In the international socialists, Tony Cliff invited people to join IS on the basis that they would have the right to the legendary right to tendency of faction in order to discuss questions. And then, of course, he reversed himself in the early 70s and started flinging everybody who didn't agree with him out, which is why there's a whole load of groups now who actually come from that tradition who were thrown out, over that whole period of the early 70s and into the late 70s, but particularly in that point. But there was you never got the impression there was particularly that. In fact, a comrade of mine who joined the Militant later, at one point, who'd actually been in the CP, was an old guy who'd been in the CP, said there was less democracy within the Militant because all the full timers were elected, were appointed from above. He said there was less democracy actually than there was in the CP at the time, because the CP, at least while the politics was terrible, at least the full timers, there was some kind of accountability of full timers to the rank and file. There was none of the Militant. I think the other thing, of course, is that this, from my point of view, here in Scotland, is a collapse in internationalism, which has happened from all the actually, interestingly enough, all the tendencies coming out of the militant tradition, one after the other. I mean, it's starting actually with Taff and the Socialist Party. Interestingly enough, this was done in private between the comrades in Scotland. It was a discussion between Sheridan and McCombs, who actually effectively ran Scottish Militant Labour, which was a section in Scotland, and Peter Taft, without any discussion among the membership at all. And they changed the policy by 180 degrees, and there was no protest, which is incredible. I've never seen an organisation in which that had happened. That an organisation in which people would put up with that sort of thing. And of course, following on that, you had obviously, interestingly enough, the last holdout actually was Socialist Appeal, who had actually the right position right up until against Scottish nationalism, right up until 2014 and the referendum. And actually, immediately after the referendum, they decided they came out in favour of Scottish nationalism. Now, this is important. In these terms, because actually, to come out in favour of Scottish nationalism is actually to reverse it's profoundly anti-Marxist. Actually, it's to say, right, that the creation of a new capitalist state is some form of progress, that some bit of the capitalist class has some progress to offer, in some part of the world, which is against, Marx, Trotsky, you name it, you can go through it, and fundamentally says, well, Marx's basic insight, which is to say that the world will be changed by the working class, and the working class has the task of liberation of humanity, is nullified. And in fact, a section of the capitalist class still has things to offer. It's just crazy, but is a symptom of political collapse. Now, I think that the core point, in terms of obviously also what you're seeing is a collapse in terms of the Labour Party as the classic formation of bourgeois workers' party. But what we're seeing here is that contradiction between the bourgeois bit and the workers' bit is being pulled apart. It's being pulled apart. Of course, what we're seeing, what we're seeing, of course, is that the thing as it has been is now unsustainable, and clearly is going to be converted by Starmer and Evans into something else, which isn't the Labour Party, and has nothing to do with the working class, nothing to do with socialism, and is a completely different political formation. So, and that I think is the core of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Roger, shall I take some more, comrades? Or do you want to come in?
Well, I could come in now, but if there's other comrades want to come in,
come in now.
I'm happy to host.
We've got a few more, but do come in now so you don't forget what people were saying.
Well, okay, just a few random points, really. First of all, I was very interested by Tony's contribution. I think certainly it's worth re-examining some of the issues that he mentions, but I believe, well, every sect said, oh well, you know, the Protestants in Northern Ireland and the Israelis, the Jewish population in Israel, they somehow they were written off by most of the left. And it's necessary to see that we have to start from the standpoint of the Communist Manifesto, that it's the interests of the entire working class that we have to start from. Now, that doesn't mean we are oblivious to the privileges and the divisions that create the political differences, the nationalism and the sectarianism and communalism in its various forms. But you have to have a program which will have some hope of winning, even among the less oppressed strata of the population, something which they can see that they have a stake in. Simply to push through unification in Northern Ireland without making any concessions or any appeals to solidarity from the Protestant working class, which after all was not a privileged stratum really, it was just not quite as oppressed as the Catholic population. It would fail. It would simply be the basis for continual conflict and sectarianism. And the same, even though it's very, very difficult within the Middle East, but we have to stand for a socialist federation of the Middle East, which will include rights for the Israelis. Now, it was wrong to create Israel. It was wrong to create Pakistan, but after a generation or two generations, you can't simply wipe them off the map. You have to have a program which appeals to the population as it is, and they are workers. They are Israeli workers. Of course, the Protestant population in Northern Ireland are overwhelmingly working class. So I don't think Militant was wrong. It may be that its propaganda or slogans might have been modified or sharpened or whatever. I don't know. I don't think so. I agree with Harry. I think the position of Militant was absolutely superb. I think it was head and shoulders above any other of the left tendencies and the left groups. You have to start with internationalism and the common interests of the working class, irrespective of nationality, of community, of any of those divisions which the capitalists use to perpetuate their rule. I agree with nearly everything that Harry said too. I think that you're quite right. The demise of Militant was not only the split, but it was also the fact of the ruthlessness with which the victors, if you like, in the split, the so-called majority, that they were terrified of being challenged politically because they did not feel confident in their political position. The difference, and I think this is where I would say something, Pam made a comment in the chat as well. I mean, the question is, the reason why the split came is basically, fundamentally, it's because the tendency had clung to the perspectives that Ted Grant had laid out decades earlier, which were brilliant and which were, extremely far-sighted and head and shoulders above any other tendency at the time. But they carried on. If you like, Militant had more or less a correct position throughout the 50s or throughout the 60s and the 70s. But by the 80s, those perspectives were becoming increasingly at odds with reality. I mean, I could explain the reasons, but it would take a long time. I have, maybe there'll be an opportunity for me to expand on this later. I have written on this question, but basically the question is that the fundamentals of Ted Grant's outlook were that the development of the boom, the fact that the strength of the trade unions, the strength of the working class in the advanced countries, the collapse in the colonial world, which led to one distorted revolution after another, with deformed workers' states established and so on, and the fact that the Stalinist bureaucracy was grinding to a halt, so would be overthrown. But as I said, the perspectives were fine, but at a certain point, general perspectives are not enough. And actually, under the surface, huge new developments had come, which I did refer to in my opening very, very briefly. But the trouble is that when the split came, the faction that stayed with Ted Grant still clung on to ossified, fossilized ideas which were no longer applicable. They were the ideas which had led the tendency into the crisis in the first place. But on the other hand, the majority faction, the Peter Taft faction, if you like, they had really they'd become completely eclectic. They'd abandoned any kind of sort of mooring or anchorage in the situation, and they followed all kinds of whims and caprices. And politically, they were incapable of meeting the challenge. And as a result, you had the kind of thing that Harry was describing, the fact that they were terrified of anybody who was an independent thinker. He mentioned John Throne. I completely agree with him. He was treated disgracefully. I would also add, I put myself in the same category. I was sort of drummed out of Militant almost within months of the split. And I flatter myself that in my case too, that they considered that they were afraid of somebody who was prepared to think for themselves and not just follow the latest line handed out by a frightened bureaucracy. So maybe we can continue that later. I think that's all I'd like to say for the moment. Perhaps more comrades will come in.
Yeah, interesting discussion. I think it teaches us a lot about how not to organize. Anthony, please.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I'm going to start. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
I also got my team, so I'll be try as slow as possible. But I think it's important that we don't become impressionistic, and with the tradition of imperialism and pragmatism in this country. And I think Marion's correct. There's an interesting theory as part of the biggest struggle against capitalism and Stalinism, which is building on a world scale. And that's why the Labour left alliance has emerged, and that's why we need to have a democratic debate. But we had to understand capitalism for the worst crisis in the Second World War. Had been for the Marshall Plan, the capitalism wouldn't have survived in Western Europe. But the dangers of impressionism are questioning the Leninist Trotskyist method, because we're in the worst crisis today. That doesn't mean they won't give concessions. That could be an artificial boom. So democracy and Stalinism is still around. There are ultra-left mistakes made in the Second World War, but also there are liquidationist tendencies that abandon the Soviet Union as a worker stay in the Cold War, around Goldman and Murray, which Ted Grant was linked up with for a period. Then we had Mandel didn't recognize the workers' states. Hatton had to polemicize with him in the late 40s and into the early 50s. Then Pablo did a zigzag. We recognized the workers' state in the political revolution, and he started adapting to Stalinism. Ted Grant recognized the workers' states. They rejected Pablo, but when Cannon led the fight against Pablo's consideration of Stalinism in East Germany and the reform of the bureaucracy, Grant linked up with him. So some people built up these great culture, these leaders, all kinds of mistakes made. I made mistakes. The biggest mistake I made recently was Sharon Graham, but that's a concrete situation. But I also want to say, I think one thing Roger's correct on is on the Labour Party. It's not a normal witch hunt. They're trying to drive a lot of the Social Democrats out. But because of the capitalist crisis, there could be mistiming. Layers of the ruling class may need reforms to get the equilibrium going. And without that, there could be revolutionary unrest. In Chile, there could be a civil war, because you've got revolutionary left candidates versus a Pinochet supporter. You've got the fascists in France, there's battles in the streets in France. The Austrian Communist Party is the largest party. But social democracy, everybody accepts is around. The Baltic New Labour and Women Social Democratic Party is yet to behave. We all agree on that. But the nature of Stalinism and what it is today, and the dangers of a zigzag are going on. Because people rush up the battle between the Yeltsin wing and the wing of the Russian capitalist restorationist pressures and the Putin wing of the bureaucracy. He came an obscure figure after the bombing of Serbia. They weren't going to put up with him much more. After the Russians got pulverized, they come in. The market reform started in China, but Tiananmen Square put a stop to that, because they nearly got overthrown the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy doesn't want to work as democracy, but it took advantage of that of people when it crushed it to get more resources, and that put pressure on Yeltsin. And been for Yeltsin coming, Deng Xiaoping would have been gone. So the battle in Eastern Europe yet to be had, and the Cold War is very sharp. It could be a 45 moment where they go into Ukraine. It could be a third world war. But I've noticed the main danger. Well, the first group didn't see the fight for democratic rights. The next mistake that was made was everything was over. Capitalist restoration is impressionism. It's a power relationship, and if Russia moves in hard, some people weren't defending Russia in Georgia. Then they started. So Russia did move a change of balance, but started adapting to Stalinism. It's a power relationship. Third campism and adaptation of Stalinism are different patterns. But I think the world revolution is going to go forward. Trotsky is more valid than ever. We've got to be flexible to win the match with a transitional approach, but don't be impressionistic. Don't go from Pavlovism to third campism and ultra-leftism. Taft lost confidence in Trotskyism, so did socialist appeal. Tegron agreed that Russia hadn't gone capitalist because he was an early 30s Trotsky. It's a very complex picture, but it'll make left turn. But we people retreat, give people room to retreat. My dad said, Lenny said, I'll finish here. When people retreat, give them the room to retreat, to get them back if they're able people. They never cut their room for retreat.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Okay, Eric, next, please.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Good. I'm just so sort of amazed, really, that I've been a Labour member since '68. I just think we should stop talking in groups, different groups. But that's, the UK Tory establishment must be laughing their heads off. They set it up well, don't they? We can put these headlines on. We can push the idea that Labour's got this faction, that faction, this faction. It's great. And all those then middle group of people who aren't particularly voters, but they will vote in an election. They don't particularly support any party. They just hear what the media put out. Oh, Labour this, Labour that, and they've got this left wing. Oh, what does left wing mean, for goodness sake? We've got to stop using those silly things. I joined because I'm a socialist, as it was described in the 1945 government. And unless you tell me different, I'm not aware that we've ever had to vote for anything different. That socialism is, as it, again, put me right if I'm wrong, in 45, where the government would own, control and directly control the major service industries and the NHS. Now that's moved a long way from there. And of course, it's much privatized, owned by international companies. Now, my view is Labour Party is a socialist party. Now, tell me if that's changed, because I don't know why. We seem to be now controlled, and I've got a feeling the last conference actually confirmed socialism, but we seem to have been controlled by groups that I want to be careful what I say, but we've always got people seem to control the party on behalf of, not behalf of the members, but behalf of whatever's needed or popular or they're pressed to do at the time. I'm really concerned. I want someone to tell me, are we still a socialist party? Should we not just be saying that we believe in government owned and directly run major service industries and NHS? Is that not where we should be? Perhaps someone will tell me. I'll give up.
Thank you, Eric. I'm not sure the Social Labour Party has ever been a socialist party, but there's probably differences on the word.
Well, that's what my membership says. That's what I'm getting at. My
Mm.
membership card says we're a socialist party. If we're not, then we ought to do something about it.
Okay, Neil, please. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
All good?
Excellent. Okay, well, greetings, comrades from down under. I'm here in the penal colony of New South Wales, thanks to COVID. But during the 1980s, I was based in Exeter, CLP. I have a number of comments here. Actually, I find myself in quite a lot of agreement with Tony. That isn't always the case, as some people might recall. Thank you, Roger, for your very interesting exposition. I do feel, though, that you were perhaps wearing some rose-tinted spectacles when you gave that glowing account of that golden period in the 1970s and 80s. First of all, the witch hunt, as other people have made clear, it was not exclusively against militant. This was talking about the 1980s witch hunt. I would like to tell you, I was also a victim of it, but I remember, for example, a meeting of the Labour Against the Witch Hunt in the 1980s, and it was attended by the likes of Diana Abbott, Tony Benn, Ken Livingstone, and of course, Jeremy Corbyn. And it was clear at that time that the witch hunt had spread well beyond militants. I mean, for example, I heard stories of comrades who had been suspended for trying to set up black sections. As people have noted, the black sections were opposed by militants. I mean, and similarly in the court cases. I mean, people know I've been banging on about this for the last year, but I was also involved in a court case which actually was instrumental in the setting up of the National Constitutional Committee, because after 1986, when the NCC was set up, the whole process by which people were dealt with changed. And of course, that institution, it wasn't perfect, but it did at least establish the principle that you were in principle entitled to a fair hearing. And that lasted really for some 30 years until it was demolished by the current regime. It's the same. I was also involved in the Labour Party Young Socialists. Well, that wasn't exclusively militant. It's the same with the anti-poll tax movement. I was heavily involved with that. In the Southwest, I was, for example, involved in a number of court cases as a Mackenzie friend, and we actually won a few of those. I also got chucked out of court a few times. I was also there at that big national demonstration in London, and I agree that it was a spectacularly successful campaign. We're agreed on that, but it wasn't exclusively militant. It was a very large non-militant component to that. Like many others, in my personal experience of militant activists was that they, on the whole, they tend to be quite sectarian, quite robotic. Some of the younger members seem to me almost like robotic imitations of Ted Grant, including imitations of the chopping hand gestures when they were speaking. And I certainly, I had some friends who were militant, but also I struggled many times when you were trying to get people together, and there was certainly some problems there. So I'm just generally echoing the view that although some of the campaigns were successful, that let's not get too romantic about that period. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Okay, Steve Freeman, and then Tony can have another bite of the cherry.
All I'm going to talk. Thank you, Roger, for your talk, and it again gets me thinking about a few different ways to think things. And but I have to make a little comment to what Matthew said. I can't bring myself not to before I turn to what Roger said. I mean, it's not the case that the British capitalist class, as represented by the Crown and the Tory party, is waging a struggle for an independent Scottish Republic. It's a split. What we see is a split within the capitalist class, as we have seen a split of the European Union as to what to do about the national question, whether it's in Ireland or Scotland, or the relationship with Europe. And that split or division is an opportunity for the working class to develop its own program and its own independent answer to the crisis. So we have to look at, this is not about following Sinn Féin or following the SNP or anything like that. It's how does the working class get its own independent perspective on the crisis of democracy and the split within the capitalist class. So it's about, therefore, about how the ruling class rules this country through the institutions of the crown. So I was thinking about what Roger's points. And I do see some parallels with the present. I mean, it's about, in one sense, it's about the success and the victories of the militant tendency and their ultimate failures. So it's about successes, we can learn from them. And it's about the failures, we must also learn from those. So what we have here is a struggle between the British Crown and the militant tendency. It's a funny way to put it, I know. Being the British Crown, being the state and the bureaucracy and the power of the state. So we've got Her Majesty's, so you identified all the players in this game. Her Majesty's government was one with Thatcher. Then we had the district auditor. Then we had Her Majesty's judges. Then we presumably had the security services involved in all this story. I don't know what they were doing, but I'm sure they were involved in it as well, being directed. And then, of course, we had the loyalist wing of the Labour Party, which was busily, and it's not therefore just a struggle within the Labour Party. It has to be seen in this wider context of the state, perhaps in one sense being pushed back a bit by Militant in their surprising successes that they made. And then, of course, getting to grips with all the forces brought to bear, and therefore leading to the defeat of militant tendency. In the same forces, by the way, that are defeating the Corbyn movement, actually, in the same way. Don't just think it's a witch hunt in the Labour Party. It's the bigger picture that's going on behind it. The security services, the Tory government, all those other things that are all there. And then I think it seems to me that from what you said, Roger, and I was trying to work out the militant tendency didn't have an answer to neoliberalism, and maybe neoliberalism disorientated militant in some ways, and led to a premature break that you described. So it went to militant Labour. It went to the Socialist Party of England and Wales, actually, at some point, because then it split into the Scottish militant Labour. So it was starting to crash on the three things that have been mentioned already. Tony mentioned Ireland. Then we have the situation in Scotland. And then we have the poll tax. The poll tax is interesting because the poll tax was a victory, but nobody took that movement anywhere else. It was a popular democratic mass movement, but it didn't go anywhere. But it didn't have a perspective of democracy or reconfiguring the system of government in this country, which is the next step, the next way it could have gone. So it didn't have a future for the poll tax movement. Because it was a mass movement, it was a mass citizens movement, and it was about local democracy. So I agree with Roger again, by the way, that when a party comes out of a new party has to come out of growth and victory rather than defeat. So we don't don't launch a party when you're being defeated, actually, in a way. You're going to launch a party as you're growing out of your success in a certain sense. And for me, the lesson from Trotsky was that the precondition for forming a party is a program. And therefore, we have to know what program is any new formation going to fight for. That if we don't have that, then we're just messing around and trying this and trying that, and we're not going to get anywhere. Now, if you think of every attempt, I'll get close to finishing it. If you think of every attempt, Scargill's Socialist Labour Party, the Socialist Alliance, Respect, Left Unity and Tusk, all these events, all these policies, all these organisations have tried to launch parties. They've all been based on one thing, which is the reformist idea that what we need to do is to reform the constitutional monarchy in the fashion of the 1945 post-war settlement and state capitalism, if you like, and Keynesian demand management and a mixed economy. It's all going back, they're all traced back to the 1945 Labour government. And what happened to Left Unity? Because I was a member of Left Unity. Left Unity was promoting the spirit of 45 under Ken Loach. He was the person who kind of sponsored that. As soon as Corbyn came along, virtually all the Left Unity members left and joined the Corbyn movement. Why? Because the thing they were promoting in Left Unity was what Corbyn was answering on a much bigger scale. There was no point in having Left Unity when Corbyn turned up. because they all had the same political program. So if we want to go in a new direction, we have to think clearly, what is the program for today, the one that now relates to the crisis that this country is, including the complete failure of our political system and our democracy that is crashing in a dangerous way around our ears. So I think the lesson from Trotsky is program first, said Trotsky, and then everything else will fall into place. And if we don't have that, then we're going round in various circles. Finish there.
Thank you, Steve. Tony, you want to have another quick go?
Yeah, I think the problem. Sorry.
That's
I
good.
think the problem with Militant is it actually had no theory of imperialism. It assumed the working class in the third world and in the colonial countries was exactly the same as the working class in the imperialist heartland. And they actually ignored what Marx said when he spoke to the English working class, and he said, a nation that oppresses another nation will not itself be free. And Marx did, these weren't just a form of words. Marx actively supported the Fenians. And at that time, there was a lot of anti-Irish hysteria amongst the British working class. And unfortunately, Militants forgot that. So, for example, in Palestine, and I could go on about Ireland, but I'm not an expert at that, but in Ireland in 1921, thousands of Catholic workers were driven out through pogroms from the shipyards, and also their Protestant supporters as well. In Israel, in Palestine, it was a Zionist labor movement that actually created the state of Israel. And it did it through forming a Jewish-only trade union, the Histadrut. And what was the main demand of the Histadrut was Jewish labor. They actively picketed out Arab workers from any employment by Jewish employers. So they were in favor of creating an autarkic, self-contained economy within an economy. And that therefore meant, for example, they actually broke up the rail workers union, a mixed left-wing union, because it wasn't Jewish only. And that was the program and the policy of the Labour Zionists throughout. So not to recognize the super oppression of the Palestinian working class, even within Israel, is a great tragedy. You have to take up the national question. You have to take up Zionism, because it's Zionism which divides that working class. To ignore that question is to ignore the oppression of the most oppressed. And in 1922, the Communist International, the Fourth Congress, it condemned, referring to Histadrut and others, the pseudo-socialist tendencies of some categories of well-paid European workers in the colonies. And if I quote David Hacohen, who was a former manager of the Histadrut building company, Sorel Bonheur, because Histadrut also was a major employer as well as a trade union, he said, describing his difficulties in explaining the dilemmas of socialist or Labour Zionism, I had to fight my friends on the issue of Jewish socialism to defend the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my trade union, the Histadrut, to defend preaching to housewives they should not buy at Arab stores, to defend the fact that we stood guard at orchards to prevent Arab workers from getting jobs there, to pour kerosene on Arab tomatoes, to attack Jewish housewives in the markets and smash Arab eggs they had bought, to buy dozens of dunhams, that is quarter of an acre, from an Arab is permitted, but to sell, God forbid, one Jewish dunham to an Arab is prohibited, to take Rothschild's the incarnation of capitalism as socialist and to name him the benefactor. To do all that was not easy. And it wasn't easy because, of course, that wasn't socialism. And that's why Labour Zionism campaigned on the slogan from class to nation. Literally, class struggle for them was a struggle in the fight against the Arabs. So to ignore all of that and to just pretend you can get unity when there are things which are dividing the working class is in the end a reformist and indeed a colonialist perspective. And that was, I think, the major fault of Militants, and it stemmed from their overall reformist program. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the national question is extremely important. I think so too. Roger, would you like to sum up now and answer a few questions and comments?
Is this a final sum up or?
I think so, yes. We've got no other people with their hands up. So I would
Well,
think so, yeah.
okay. I don't see there's a lot. Obviously, the whole discussion about the militant position on the national question in Ireland, in the Middle East or whatever, is a whole new discussion itself. And I think, you know, I look forward to us having a discussion on that and a debate on that. But I completely reject the idea that Militant had anything but a thoroughly internationalist and Marxist position on these questions. I absolutely reject the implication that that it was somehow ran away from there's so many ways to put this, that it ran away from a fight against the privileges of either the Protestant community in Northern Ireland or of the Jewish community in Israel. But you have to put more than simply a nationalist point of view. You have to put an internationalist point of view, and you have to start with the common interests of the working class. And that is the first elementary lesson, which comes from as far back as the Communist Manifesto, that the communists don't support this or that section or faction of the ruling class, of the working class, but they support the general interests and they point out the common interests of the working class. And of course, that means taking on the reactionaries taking on the Zionists, taking on the loyalists and so on. And I completely, I completely cannot accept that comrades in Militants, either in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, where they had an absolutely unblemished record, a heroic record, and I salute the contribution of Harry on that, nor in relation to Israel, that they ever made concessions towards the more privileged strata of the population. You have to put an internationalist position. We put a position while of course recognizing the particular interests of the most oppressed strata. I don't know whether there's anything else that came up, but I do think that we should have a discussion on those questions, on the questions of nationalism, perhaps specifically on Israel and on Northern Ireland, and what a Marxist approach would be to that. Finally, in the end, we talk about democracy within the movement. The Militant always prided itself on the fact that it had complete freedom of discussion and so on within it. And that was true just up to the point when people began to challenge the ideas of the leadership. I mean, it's the same everywhere. It's very easy to be in favor of democratic debate. And the point is that it's a constant struggle. I don't know if comrades know about the organization that I am now associated with, which is the Workers' International Network. But I do think that we live up to the best traditions and the best aspirations of Militant in its heyday, in the sense that we are organizing weekly forums of discussion where there's complete freedom of discussion, where there isn't a particular line which is pushed, because we don't consider ourselves to be a cadre organization. We consider ourselves to be, as is fitting with the situation we're in today, that we need to develop the basis of a real genuine mass parties and mass international, which would be on the basis of uniting the struggles of the working class. And that presupposes that there will be differences, that there will be different levels and different points of view and so on. And we have the most democratic discussions that I've ever been involved in anywhere in the movement, and that includes in the days of Militant, and where we have participants from up to, I think we have a total of 32 countries that have been represented in our meetings, And very much it's a question of hearing first-hand eyewitness reports from participants in the struggles that are breaking out worldwide. So I think we're taking the best of the traditions of militants, and we're also decisively rejecting the mistakes which led it to its demise. I do think partly it was objectively based. It would not have been possible, for instance, comrades talk about what happened with the poll tax and so on. It didn't go anywhere, and quite correct after that. But remember, because of the objective conditions that I described before, the poll tax was, if you like, the last fling of an earlier epoch, just as the miners' strike was. Now, of course, there are new battles, new struggles, and new forces that are coming into the fray. And we have to equip ourselves based on the best traditions of the past to meet those challenges. I think I'll leave it at that, comrades. Thank you to all comrades for a very stimulating and democratic discussion.
Yes, that was interesting, wasn't it? I enjoyed it. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, comrades, for intervening.